Uncommon is a production by Neuralle, a unique digital agency. Neuralle specializes in content production in the areas that matter most to your content strategy across podcast production, video production, and social media. If you want to increase your conversion or grow your brand trust, head to neuralle.com to request a callback. That's neuralle.com.
My name's Jordan Michaelides and I'm the host of Uncommon, a show that asks the why on business, current affairs, media, and sport. If you like this episode, do of course like and subscribe. This will help the YouTube algorithm work out whether you like this type of content. To find all previous guests, just head to neuralle.com/uncommon. For podcast audio, search Uncommon on all your good podcast apps, including Apple Podcasts and Spotify. For social, keep up to date with behind the scenes at uncommon_show. With all that being said, let's get into the episode. My guest this week, Charlie Clausen. As I was saying before, St Kilda's number 2 ticket holder, former star of Home and Away, host of many a podcast, including Wil Anderson and Osher Günsberg. I think I emailed you Monday and I was hoping that we would have something positive to chat about today.
Yeah.
But after Monday's insipid performance, how are you feeling?
Well, I think a lot of St Kilda supporters like yourself need to just get a grip. All right.
Yes.
We've had a good season. Let's not start flipping out over one loss to a very good football team who have been in good form with probably the best power forward in the competition. After a 4-day break, I was counselling a friend yesterday.
3 day.
I was counselling a St Kilda supporter friend yesterday who was like, Brad Hill, we paid too much for him. He's too soft.
Which is classic, isn't it? I feel like the other day, let me read the text message I have with my 2 uncles and my dad. This is the shit I have to put up with. And this is why my brother's are no longer in the conversation group. So, by the way, I didn't receive any responses at all. Nothing at all to 3 on the trot, 4 on the trot until this week when we start going shit. And it was here we go. Oh, my uncle's complaining about Carlisle. I reckon Carlisle needs to be traded.
Although there is a great season.
Yeah, I know he's having a good season, but he does have he's got some discipline issues, that guy, I reckon.
Yeah, he's our token dickhead. Every team has to have one.
You've got to have one. Yeah, so that's where I brought up the 3 full days rest because my Uncle Jeff was having a sook about that. Someone was saying, who's weak and lazy? Carlisle. Apparently Carlisle's weak and lazy.
Look, I mean, St Kilda supporters are nothing if not dramatic.
Oh, it's sort of it's sort of part of the identity, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, Will and I, before we started doing 2 Guys, 1 Cup, which is we would say AFL podcast, but we've come to realize it's a bit more AFL adjacent podcast. But we did have long discussions, him being a Bulldog supporter, prior to them winning a flag in 2016. But we did have long discussions about how much do you think barracking for a team and putting this much energy into a team that are perennial losers, how do you think that affects your psyche? Because if you applied that to any other relationship in your life, like a career or a personal relationship where you were constantly being let down, constantly disappointed, sometimes humiliated, it would be considered an abusive relationship. And a lot of your friends would be saying, why don't you just leave?
Yeah, or you'd be getting medicated for it. Yeah. It is bizarre, but that's the tribal element, right? Of football. Yeah. You can't ever leave the team.
And it's also too because we've been so close. We have been to the summit and have just not quite planted the flag, and that just makes it even more tantalizing because I distinctly remember I've been to every grand final. I've seen 4 losses, 3 losses and a draw. But I distinctly remember in 2009 at quarter time against Geelong thinking, fuck, we're all over them. This is going to be easy. Yeah. We're going to win by 5 goals. This is going to be one of those grand finals where I can just sit back and relax because it's in the pocket. And then just watching over the next few quarters, just consistently
slow decay
goals, consistently missing, then getting down to the wire and still thinking to myself, well, we're still playing better than them. And somehow we lost.
Yeah. Do you know what? That's a good example of the drama of being a St Kilda supporter. My father, who is a recklessly hardworking man, never really celebrates or sort of enjoys or smells the roses of life, so to speak. Typical immigrant mentality, right? Always has to be working. And I remember that night he didn't come home, which my mum was genuinely worried. Like, she came to me at 4 a.m. like, where's your dad? And he was at Crown. He was in bed at Crown all night long, and he came home at like 6 a.m. and he was in the worst of moods. And what made it worse is for the week afterwards, he couldn't believe that he paid $700 a piece for me and my brother to get tickets off someone.
Well, I did some amazing tap dancing to get my ticket because I didn't have a ticket, but because I have a bunch of mates who work in the media and stuff, there was AFL events happening all grand final week. So I was going along with them.
Yeah.
In my mind, thinking I'll be able to hit someone up. I'll be able to find someone. And sure enough, I was chatting to the old president of the Brisbane Lions. I can't remember his name, but he was a lovely guy. And he was like, wow, you're a real keen Saints supporter. So you must be going on Saturday. And I was like, I can't get a ticket. And he's like, oh, that's terrible. You should definitely, if anyone is here should go, you should definitely go. I said, I know. And so he called over Gil, who wasn't the top dog at that stage. I think he was second in command or whatever. And he's like, Gil, this guy's a rabid St Kilda supporter. Surely, like, can I give him my ticket and maybe I'll sit in the dining room and I can watch from there? And Gil's like, no, we want all the presidents to be sitting together. We've got a section for you guys. And then Gil's turned to me and he's gone, how big a fan are you? And I said, I'm massive. Been going since I was like 5 years old. And he's going, name me the last 5 St Kilda captains. And so I rattled him off and he's gone, okay, and gave me this number to call. And so it was this like secret bat number that you called at AFL House, and they had like a secret stash of tickets. So I called this guy and he's gone, oh, that's right. So Gil gave me 2 tickets. So I gave one to a mate who was also like a dyed-in-the-wool Saints supporter, and I went myself. And obviously we lost. That was terrible. But then the next year, 2010, I haven't advanced my membership status at all or made any plans to get grand final tickets organised, but I still had this number. And so I called it again, grand final week. And the guy was like, hang on, didn't you call last year? And I was like, yeah. And he's like, you've had 12 months to up your membership status. How come you haven't done it?
Fuck. So, that's hilarious. My dad knew and is very good mates with one of the prominent player managers in Perth. He played footy with him because my uncle played classic like Bentley Moorabbin boys. They played at St Kilda under-19s, or they played for like the Bentley Demons, which is a really closely affiliated club. So they always knew people, and they knew this player manager. I don't want to say his name because basically they would just sell the tickets of the players they manage. And obviously he's in WA.
Right.
None of them are going. They're not going to make the flight over because they don't give a shit about St Kilda or Geelong.
Yeah.
There'll be a few, obviously, but then they would sell those tickets, and so they were not cheap. But it had me thinking about what I asked a lot of my guests about their early childhood, and it was the same thing I spoke to Wil about. Is how did this love affair begin? Like, how were you in the unfortunate bloodline of getting into St Kilda?
I think it was just one of those things. It's like, I was also raised Catholic. You don't question it as a child. You don't ask, what is this cult I'm entering? You just go along with it. So St Kilda was kind of the same. It was just, on the weekends, the TV would be on and we'd watch the football. And I think my earliest memory is my dad was an MCC member. He used to love going to cricket and footy and all that. And so my earliest memory was going into the MCC members with him. So, yeah, it was the experience of going to the football. It was the meat pie. It was the donuts. It was like the biffo. I mean, the one thing that kind of threw me is like when I sort of came into football and become more aware of it, like we were at our absolute worst, like right in the pit of winning all those wooden spoons. And I remember like all my mates barracked for Carlton and the Bombers and Hawthorn. And there was this kind of like frustration about like, how come, because at the time as well, the Australian cricket team was kind of shit. And it's like, so in summer, the team I barrack for is shit. And in winter, the team I barrack for is shit. And there was this frustration. But then that all kind of changed around the late 80s with Plugger and Winmar and Strelo and stuff. And so I think that if it had gone, say, my first 15 years and we had never played finals or anything, then I probably would have lost interest in the same way that I sort of lost interest with the cricket. Like, it's sort of the opposite. The cricket, we got really good and I lost interest. But St Kilda's, there's so much drama in the St Kilda story, and we go from being good to bad that, you know, and if I'm 100% honest, you know, after sort of 97, 98, my interest waned a little bit again, and I moved to Sydney. But then, you know, after the Super Draft, I sort of came back into it. And then I was back in Melbourne from 2003 to 2009, which was like the golden era. That's the... Even now, I will go back and look at clips of that period and be like, Jesus, how did we not win a flag with that list? Just so much talent.
Yeah, that my dad always talks about that Port Adelaide
prelim.
That prelim, yeah, that's probably I'm probably in a similar boat. I was about 7 or 8 when we lost that grand final in '97, and I remember crying the entire way home. And it was actually quite a pivotal moment for me because I didn't like playing football, but I loved St Kilda. And I decided then and there that I wasn't going to play football at all. And I completely started playing soccer when it was still quite an unusual thing in Australian families to be playing soccer, albeit, you know, I've got this Greek side of the family. Yeah. My dad wanted to be as Aussie as meat pie.
Yeah, right.
And he looked like a wog, but he spoke like an Aussie. And it was this weird thing because I remember going to the soccer club and, you know, getting the shin guards and thinking like, what the fuck is this? And like, it was a Greek club. So like at the end of training, they'd be making souvlaki and stuff like that. And we were just like, what is this shit? What is this world? It was so bizarre. And it was quite a pivotal moment. But then obviously I came back into it like 2001, 2002.
Yeah.
Growing up though, I guess I'm curious, what was your childhood like growing up in general?
Well, it's interesting. Growing up, it was fine. I mean, it's only in retrospect you sort of look back at things and be like, oh yeah. I mean, my experience as a child was you know, pretty wonderful. Like big family, big Catholic family, lots of brothers and sisters, you know, and so there's always like siblings to play with. There was a lot of imagination, a lot of creativity. But my father died when I was 10, and that kind of was the first disruption that I was aware of. And then also prior to that, when I was 2 years old, I had the second elder sister in my family, Annabelle, committed suicide. So that's what I mean by in retrospect, I look back and I realized there was an awful lot of grief in my family growing up that I wasn't aware of as a child. And I think that my mum and dad and my siblings did a pretty amazing job of sheltering me through that, but then also providing support like around that experience. So,
were you the youngest?
I was the youngest, yeah. Wow. And it wasn't really until I started going to therapy as an adult, and I started sort of going back over all this kind of stuff that, you know, I was talking to my therapist about, you know, my early memories from childhood and you know, how my parents were and their attitudes and demeanor and, you know, my siblings as well. And she said, well, you know, you've got to remember that you were sort of born into a family that was grieving. You know, at the age of 2, there's this tragic loss in the family, and, you know, that sends sort of ripples through the family. And then, you know, 8 years later, I'm sort of poking my head out into the world, you know, heading out of childhood into adolescence, and my father dies. And so that's another kind of big hit. And so, you know, it kind of, I think, put me on a path of feeling like the world could be quite unstable and things are very fleeting and bad things happen. And so there was a lot of kind of, I don't know if it's fear, but there was a bit of anxiety I noticed that was sort of, you know, seeped into my behavior and my choices and stuff. And I think a lot of the reason why I went into a more creative field rather than, you know, like a standard 9 to 5 is that my mother, who I was very close to, especially after my father died, had seen my dad, who was a dentist, spend his whole life working this job that he hated. You know, my dad never really wanted to be a dentist. He was sort of pushed into it by his parents, and he worked very hard, very long hours, but, it didn't really make him happy. And I think that after that, mum's advice was always, and it's, the cliche, but, do what you love. It's better that you put your energy into something that you really, really love. And so when I say it was a good childhood, it obviously had all these difficulties of, losing family members and stuff. But I think out of that came some really positive stuff. Like in terms of my exposure to things, really heavy concepts like death and stuff, I had to deal with that at a pretty young age, which I think as an adult has kind of made me much more philosophical and circumspect. My mother actually passed away 5 years ago, and it was a pretty extraordinary experience to go through that, having lost a parent as a child and then losing one as an adult, and then sort of comparing the two experiences, one being destabilizing and, in some levels, kind of traumatizing in a way, and then having the opportunity to redo that and do it for the better, my mother's, she died of cancer, and she, at a point, decided to stop chemotherapy. So she made the choice to to die. And it was done with such grace and dignity, and really just was a great lesson for me about how to approach not just life, but things like family. Like the last thing she said to me, or one of the last things, was, because we were talking, I did a couple of podcasts with her, and we really explored her entire life. And she was saying to me that, the only two things you really leave behind are the things you create and the relationships you make. No one remembers your bank account. No one remembers how big your house was, how many cars you had, all that kind of stuff. Like even when it came time to pack up her apartment, she had this lovely apartment filled with lovely things. And so we had like an auction house come through, and they were looking at her belongings, and there was her crystal set and her fine silverware and stuff. And they were like, oh, we'll give you $50 for that. Oh, that's $200 for that. We're like, no. You don't understand. That's mum's crystal. That's mum's silverware. And they're like, oh yeah, but you understand there's deceased estates all the time. Like, and everyone has fine dining, And so it really kind of solidified my mind that, all this shit that you kind of get anxious about accumulating, the stuff that you think you need that'll make you happy, it's really not as important as the relationships. Like seeing how hard my mother worked on keeping the family together, post dad's death. And then, in the next 20, 25 years, 30 years after that, she was very good at fostering those relationships amongst all her, 8 children. And
8 children, wow.
And since then, my family's been pretty amazing. Like I've been really proud of how we've all stayed in contact. I mean, I'm the youngest, and I'm in my early 40s. So like, it's a real broad range of personalities and ages in my family. But I do think that mum was the one who established this idea of you talk about everything, you don't let things sort of fester, and you maintain contact. And so, I mean, it's a big rambling answer from what was a pretty standard question about childhood, but that's kind of what I feel is that, it was a fairly unstable childhood, but because of the influence of my family and my mother, I think that as an adult, I've actually come out of it, really well adjusted and with some really great perspective.
Yeah, and I think only real life experiences like that can do that to a person. My grandma used to always say, I had a very close relationship with my grandmother, and she'd always say like, oh, I'm so lucky, because she never really had monumental moments like that. She had a family that, oh yes, her husband died at an age younger than people would have expected, but he was still 70. None of her sons died before her. No one really around her was terribly ill. She lived a very thorough life, like a very extroverted, outgoing life. And it's really interesting. You talk about how, you get the crystal set and all that. We had a similar thing because she got dementia in the last sort of 5 years of her life. And the last 5 years, she just sort of became a shell of herself. And I remember she lived in Carrum, and we had to go through all her stuff. And it's so hard because some of the stuff you attach meaning to, but there's all these things around the place that, you're not sure what the meaning is to her, but you know,
Sure.
if you were to throw it out, that there would be massive meaning to it. Like, and a good example would be my grandfather recorded all the Faulty Towers on VCR. And so everyone was adamant this had to be kept.
That's amazing.
And we still had it. Like, I actually just went through all this stuff recently because we're deciding what are we going to get converted from VCR to like DVD or digital or something like that. And there's so many funny old things like that. And like, all of us remember like the ads that were in between the shows and everything. And everyone would regularly talk about it. But to an ordinary person, it's just a fucking VCR.
Yeah,
Like,
and that's the stuff that does matter. Like, I think when we did pack up Mum's place, we sort of went round as a group, like a group of 8, and literally room by room, item by item, does anyone want this? If they don't, you know, it's going to charity or it's going in the bin. And the bulk of what we all kept was all, because my mother was an artist, was all just all her paintings and stuff and her writings and things like that, and little bits of, you know, little trinkets and items that, you know, made us think of her, you know, stuff that she kept on her mantelpiece or in her bedroom or whatever. But the majority of it, the furniture just all went.
oh,
and
yeah. Furniture.
it was funny too, because there was a bit of kind of consternation around what to do with her apartment. Like, half the family wanted to hang on to it and the other half wanted to sell it. And, you know, I was firmly in the camp of wanting to sell because I don't get sentimental around things like that. And when I went down to stay at her apartment after she'd passed away on my own, it didn't feel like her apartment anymore. Once that, you know, you remove the personality, the individual from the space, and then it just becomes a room, you know, like it's not anything. And I don't have any sort of sentimentality towards, like, I've never driven past the building anymore. Like, you know, it's not like I have this sort of a regret about us selling the apartment, but I love the artwork we have, and I love reading her diaries, and I love all that kind of stuff, because then, you know, she stays alive. It's funny you should mention Faulty Towers, because just recently my wife and I have been doing this real deep dive on Monty Python.
Really?
And for similar reasons. Like, we just stumbled across the Netflix documentary on Monty Python, and we started watching it, and then we both started sharing stories about how much Monty Python made us think of our families and made us think of our childhood. And it was the common language, you know, amongst my entire family, from my father down to me, you know, the youngest, is we all love Faulty Towers. We love Monty Python. And, you know, and so we've just binged about 5 different Monty Python documentaries, like 3 different films. And it really, I think it, you know, they're a unique example. And, you know, John Cleese, especially with Faulty Towers, is that kind of stuff does connect a family. Like, it's the kind of thing you would sit and watch with your grandparents, you know, and you both get it, and it's a really bonding experience.
Yeah, it becomes sort of like the lingua franca of sort of the family. I remember for us, it was like the Simpsons references.
Yeah.
It was like the Seinfeld. Seinfeld was huge. And we actually, me and my partner, we watched all, how many episodes are there? Like 50 or 60 episodes? Something
Of what?
like that, of Seinfeld.
Oh, right. I'm not sure.
Obviously, because we're locked down, but we watched everything, and I've already seen them all. But it just and then I just send like little quotes to my dad or an uncle or something about that. But you're right. I feel like there's sort of 2 key lessons there, but the big one is stories. And I think it probably makes sense for you in particular, because at the end of the day, you're in an industry where your profession is storytelling. Which sort of goes back to what you learned from your old man, and that you should do what you want to do. So I guess I was curious, like, when I was looking up like your history, you know, and the early career stuff is really hard to find. Like, you can find your filmography, but anything about what you did in life before that, apart from listening to TOFOP and general little tidbits mentioned here and there, there's no concise, like, what did Charlie study? How did he get into acting or anything like that?
Yeah, well, I guess it was because there was no real, it wasn't like a direct path. I mean, I was always good at writing. Like, that was, you know, that was clear from the start, you know, English lit. You know, I just had a knack for it. I was a voracious reader and all that kind of stuff. And then I sort of did dabble with drama in high school. I did like 2 years of it, but I didn't get on with one of the teachers that they had there, and so that kind of put me off. But I went to, in my year at high school, two comedians that you'd probably know, Lawrence Leung and Michael Chamberlain, were both in my year. And those guys, I was really good friends with Michael. I knew Lawrence. We weren't like best buddies or anything, but I, was aware of him. And those two guys in particular were always doing stuff at high school that was very kind of left of center and very creative and just sort of really, I always thought that Michael was just, even at the age of like 12, like Michael seemed to know what he wanted to do. Like he was always writing like little sketches and comedy bits.
Yeah.
And he even revived our high school newspaper, which had been dormant for 5 years because of some scandal in which like the students had shown the teachers, one copy of what they were going to use and then printed something entirely different that was very defamatory to staff. And so the magazine had been banned. But then Michael revived it and he ended up writing like 90% of the articles in it. And like some of them were like satirical and some of them were like hard hitting, analysis of like the school's culture and stuff. And so we started hanging out more and doing stuff together. And then he was the one who kind of talked me into, in my final year of high school, doing the High School Musical, which is Les Mis.
Oh, really?
And that really kind of sort of sparked my interest in like, holy shit, like I had so much fun. And, I went to an all boys school and suddenly we're hanging out with girls and, like everything about it was just.
Hey, what school did you go to?
Xavier College.
Ah, okay. For a second, I thought you were about to say Brighton. I went to
no.
BGS. My brother got a scholarship and I was lucky enough to go there. Otherwise, I would have gone to CBC.
Right. Yeah. So, I think that was where it kind of started. And then Michael and I, in our final year of high school, we talked about going to uni together and studying film so we could become directors. That was the plan. And so, I made a bunch of short films in high school and, wrote a bunch of things. And then we went to Deakin University. In retrospect, we were accepted by both RMIT and Deakin, but we chose Deakin. And in retrospect, I wish we'd chosen RMIT because I believe the course I studied at Deakin no longer exists. The campus has been bulldozed. We used to be next to Monash Uni. It was called Rusden, Deakin University Rusden.
Ah, yeah.
But they bulldozed it and turned it into a car park for Monash Uni. But even that was a kind of really kind of interesting experience. So we did 3 years of a media arts degree in which we just went out with cameras and wrote shit. And Michael was off doing comedy reviews at Melbourne Uni and stuff like that. And I was getting more into sort of straight kind of drama. Like I'd done a couple of amateur plays and then I got spotted by an agent doing one of these amateur shows and then I got myself an agent and then started doing a couple of commercials. And by the time we left, we left university and then we both started working for this production company in Melbourne called Exit Films, who are still around. They're a commercial production company. They were one of the biggest in Australia at one point. But back in that day, they were very, very edgy and experimental. They made ads, but they also, the guy who ran it was this Danish guy called Henrik Dannefjord, who was this real visionary. And he had seen one of these comedy review shows that Michael had been in and had brought these guys in to make a comedy pilot, a sketch comedy pilot. So Michael tapped me on the shoulder and said, we need writers and performers. So we spent like almost 2 years at Exit. We weren't getting paid, but they gave us facilities. They gave us an office and we had access to their gear and their editing facilities. And we were just out making stuff constantly. And so it was almost like the 3 years of uni was leading up to this. Like we actually did more work and learnt more about the industry in the 2 years after the formal studies. And Henrik was so ahead of his time. This was like 2000. And he had this idea that we should be making comedy videos for the internet. He had this idea that people would be watching sketches online. And so we were going out to meet all these startups. This was back during the startup boom. And he couldn't convince anyone that people are going to be watching videos on the internet. It's like, that's not going to happen. That's not going to happen. Like he had the right idea. It's just 5 years too early. So
in hindsight,
he couldn't afford to keep us in the office anymore. So he gave us like a deadline or a timeline to wrap things up. So Michael and Charlie Pickering was the other comedian who was there. Charlie Pickering, Michael and I, we spent the next few months, whatever it was, just writing a bunch of sketches and filming a comedy pilot. So at that point, I started getting like professional acting work. I moved up to Sydney because I got a job on an ABC drama. And then Michael and Charlie started doing stand-up. And then our pilot got seen by someone at Channel 7. And so we got brought into Channel 7 and we became enlisted in a show called Big Bite, which was like Chris Lilly and Angela and Rebecca. So that's kind of where it all started. So I was sort of at this kind of fork in the road where my friends were all going down comedy, and I even had tried comedy. I did a few stand-up gigs, but I was getting hired as an actor in dramas, like as dramatic actors. So
yeah, well, I found one of those on the beach, Seaman Byers.
Oh yeah, that was my first ever acting role. Yeah,
it's on YouTube. You can see the film. You can see it in Spanish.
Telly movie.
Yeah, it was a telly movie.
That's a hilarious story. That was my first ever acting role. And so On the Beach is based on a novel which is turned into a film in the 1950s with Gregory Peck and Ava Gardner. And it was shot in Australia because the plot is about an encroaching, nuclear holocaust. And everyone has migrated to Australia because it's the last continent that hasn't been affected by fallout. And Gregory Peck in it plays this admiral, and he's very stoic and very Gregory Peck-esque. Now, in this telly movie, which was a two-parter, they hired like Brian Brown and Rachel Ward, but in the Gregory Peck role, they hired Armand Asante, who was kind of like your typical, shooting something in Australia, they'll get some, B-lister from America, but he's the star in the production.
Yeah.
And so, I only had a few lines. I was playing a sailor who had gone AWOL, and, the scene is that me and this other guy have gone AWOL. We get a dressing down from this admiral who's like, the speech is along the lines of, we make a commitment to serve, your country, and your men depend on you, and blah, blah, blah. And it was a very stoic, noble kind of speech. And then, we leave. But when we turn up, Armand Asante's there, and the director, Russell Mulcahy, director of Razorback and Highlander, he didn't really seem that interested in directing anything. He was just over by the catering, eating stuff. He's like, yeah, you guys rehearse. I'll be over in a minute. And so Armand Asante, we start the rehearsal. He just starts going off script, like ad-libbing. And he goes from what on the page was a very stoic Gregory Peck-esque monologue to a real Al Pacino, any given Sunday kind of like, he's pacing back and forth and doing this growly kind of thing. And me and this other actor are like, what the fuck's going on? Like, where do our lines come in? Because he was not sticking to the script. And then he just explodes and he's like, you don't want to be on this fucking boat. You don't have to be on this fucking boat. I'll pound out of this fucking boat. And so like he grabs me in a headlock and like flings me off the boat and grabs the other guy and kicks him in the ass. And they call cut and we're like, what was that? Shit, I've got a line in there. And they're like, it doesn't matter. Like we're changing the scene around. So they do it again. And I'm like, this is my only fucking chance to get, I'm not going to let Armand Asante steal my line. So I'm desperately trying to spit out my line, but he's ranting and raving. And by the end of it, when they called cut on the actual scene, like the other actor I was with, he was fuming. He was like, fuck this guy, like fuck acting. I'm never doing that again. But then Armand Asante, like he seeks us out. His assistant seeks us out and he drives us in his private car to lunch and gives us all these stories about working on Mumbo Kings with Antonio Banderas and making Judge Dredd with Sylvester Stallone. So it wasn't all bad in the end. I mean, I'm surprised I stuck with it. But.
Where did he take you for lunch?
Oh no, like in the catering tent.
Okay.
But it was just like while everyone else had to walk the 500 meters, he drove us. His assistant drove us there. So it was pretty special.
I looked it through the whole thing. I remember you on Blue Heelers. I was obsessed with Blue Heelers. Never really got into McLeod's Daughters, and Home and Away was a thing that I was into when I was a lot younger. For most people, either you're really young or you're really sort of old. In that my mum's demographic.
Exactly.
When did you realize you were good at it?
I don't know if I know if I am. It's like it was one of these things where. I knew I could write, I knew I could direct, I knew I could produce, and I knew I could act, but I didn't know if I did any of these things particularly well. But that wasn't a concern for me. I was like, well, whatever someone wants to hire me to do, that's what I will do till I can get to the next lily pad. So, I mean, my first day on set of a Head Start, which was the ABC show, I was absolutely shitting myself because I had no idea about the technicalities of acting. Like, they showed me my mark. I didn't even know what that meant. And then the director said, okay, we're going to loop the scene a few times. And so I'll call cut. And I didn't know what looping a scene meant. And all of it was learnt on the job. And I sort of came to realize, like, there's a lot of faking it till you make it in every industry.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's a lot harder to fake it till you make it when, you're in front of a camera. Like, it's not like you can just go off and practice and practice and practice. Like, people get exposed pretty quick. And so, although I hadn't been formally trained, I started going off to do little workshops here and there. And then I had a bit of a gap between, before I did Home and Away, I hadn't really been in anything full time for about 4 or 5 years. And I'd sort of accepted that. And I was like, okay, well, I had this production company and I was writing and producing, and that was what I was doing. And then when Home and Away came along, and I sort of met everyone who worked on the show, I found out that they had like a full-time drama coach, and mainly for the younger actors on the show to help them. So I sought her out, and she's amazing. Her name's Jen Hegney. She's a fantastic actor in her own right, but a really fantastic acting teacher. And I just said to her, look, I've managed to work for the last, 15 years as an actor, but I've never really had a method or a strategy. I just kind of do it. Do you think you could help me with that? And she's like, absolutely. And so I spent the next 5 years on Home and Away really just sort of treating it like I was a mature age student, that I was going back to school, because the great thing about that show, and there's many things I loved about working on that show, but you just get your hours up. I mean, it's not always Shakespeare, but you are going to stay match fit because you're constantly reading scripts, you're constantly breaking them down, you're constantly looking for the fastest, way into a scene. And you just come out of it, it's no surprise that so many actors go on from Home and Away to, have really great careers, because, you just, especially when you turn up on a set, in the States or whatever, where, my very limited experience in America is that actors over there are very spoiled and kind of have the attitude of being stars before they've actually even done anything. Whereas Australians are very blue collar in their approach. They've got talent, but they've also got tremendous work ethic. And I think a lot of that comes from this soap factory, or even actors who come through theatre in Australia. Like, to do what an actor in Australia does, you're sacrificing so much. The work is irregular. You don't even get paid that well when you do get paid. So to still be doing it, for a number of years, you've either got to be very talented or very hardworking, and either of those two attributes will serve you well when you want to take it further.
Yeah, it does make a lot of sense. You're right. A lot of people who've come from Home and Away and Neighbours have done pretty well when they go overseas, or at least to the States. And that, I mean, it just goes back to that grind. I think that you're mentioning. You said before about this production company in between. Was it Tricky Business and Home and Away?
Yeah, so around about, no, Tricky Business would happen right in the middle. It was probably around about 2008. It was when my wife, she left film school. So when we met, she was an artist who had been working in graphic design for about 10 years, but she always had wanted to be a filmmaker, but she didn't really know how. And then through meeting some of my friends who were involved in film, it kind of gave her the confidence that she should apply to VCA to study film directing. So she got into VCA and did really well. A couple of her final films won a bunch of awards, and then she came out and joined, as most directors do, like a production company, but just wasn't really sort of feeling it. A lot of these commercial production companies, especially when you're a new director, you're very low on the food chain. And so she just said to me, why don't you produce for me? And I was very reluctant because I'm like, I don't know anything about producing. But, Gemma is, she's got tremendous drive and a real fearlessness. And so she was so confident that I was like, well, fuck, I mean, she thinks I can do it. Well, maybe I can do it. And I could. I mean, the thing is, producing, and, you probably know this from doing this show, is it's really about problem solving. You just have to get something done. And it's really about picking up the phone and, making schedules work and, budgeting and all that kind of stuff. So we just started off small, making stuff for ourselves, short films and things like that. And then we started pitching on music videos back when music videos had budgets. So, and you know, we ended up, we started off doing like small artists and then ended up being like the go-to guys for Sony every time someone won X Factor or Australian Idol. So we did clips for like Guy Sebastian, you know, Natalie Bassingthwaighte, you know, Reese Maston, Wes Carr, all these.
Reese Maston, wow.
All these kind of, you know, singing show winners. And look, it wasn't necessarily the kind of music that we would listen to, but just like when Michael and Charlie Pickering and I were at Exit, we used it as an opportunity to teach ourselves how to, you know, be better at this. So, you know, we would pitch an idea where we got to use like a jib arm, or we'd pitch an idea where we got to use a low loader, or we would pitch an idea where we got to, you know, shoot stunt work or all this kind of stuff. And it was essentially, we were making a little bit of money, not huge money, but enough to cover our rent and enough to pay ourselves a little bit. But the main benefit was we didn't have to get other jobs. You know, we just were full-time filmmakers for that period. So it was probably like a 5-year period in which, music videos and little commercial jobs paid the rent the bulk of the time. And then in between that, you know, we made a couple of shorts. We made one called The Wake, which was based on my experiences when my father died. It's all set, you know, obviously at a wake. And, you know, we made that on a weekend using all favors, and it was a fucking disaster. Like, It was one of those Melbourne days where it was torrential rain and then 40-kilometre winds, and everyone thought we were going to cancel the shoot, but, you know, our lead actor was only available for this day. And then when we were shooting, there was like a lawnmower going off in the background, and then like traffic noises. And I remember like looking at this final cut and being like, oh my God, like what a disaster. But we entered into a few festivals anyway, and it started getting picked up, and we got into Palm Springs, we got into Tribeca, we got into London. And I remember like we were fairly broke at that point, but when we found out we got into Palm Springs, we just put it all on a credit card. We jumped on a plane, flew over to LA, drove out to Palm Springs, and it was the best thing we ever did, because once we got there, it was like a real, not only is it an amazing festival for filmmakers, because they have the short films and stuff, and it's great to go, and they've packed audiences and really enthusiastic audiences. You know, you sort of, you know, when you're a creative in Australia, you can sort of just feel a bit invisible sometimes because, you know, there's just not the market for what you do. But over there, you're a short filmmaker and you get treated like, you know, you're Peter Jackson. It was crazy. You know, people putting up their hands and saying, oh, that decision to have the lawnmower go off in the opening scene, you know, is that to reflect the characters in a turmoil? I'm like, yes, absolutely. That was a deliberate choice. But the great thing about it was it kind of made us realize, oh, we're actually good enough. You know, our instincts are correct, and we're good enough to make a film that travels internationally. And, you know, from that festival, we met a bunch of other festival programmers who picked up our film and took it to their festivals. And it just sort of, it came at just the right time where we were, you know, just not sure if we were wasting our time or not. And it was just the shot of confidence we needed. So, that's kind of, and that was happening, you know, in between, you know, my last acting job and pre-Home and Away. So it was kind of, I'd really taken a turn in a different direction. But then when Home and Away came along, it was like, oh, this is great. I don't have any responsibility except to turn up and say some lines.
It was really interesting looking at Gemma's profile. Like, she's quite an accomplished TVC producer. Like some really, really good ads. So I guess I was curious, like, what have you learnt from her? Just her being on the other side of the camera and you being the actor?
Oh, it's a lot. You know, she's, I think we balance each other out quite well. You know, we always say that, you know, I'm the words and she's the pictures. So, you know, we have a new production company now called Magic Hour, which is a commercial production company. And so we'll pitch on jobs together. So I will write the treatments and Gem will design them up. And then obviously she gets the job and Gem goes and shoots them. But Gem is just very ambitious and has this kind of, like I said, this fearlessness that I am in such awe of, because she doesn't really take no for an answer, and she doesn't feel like, you know, when I was producing for her, I could sometimes be quite frustrating because she would have this big idea and then I would immediately look at the numbers or immediately look at the restrictions of why we couldn't do it. And she'd always be like, don't say why. Like, don't, when I put something forward, at least roll with it for a bit before you start raining on my parade. And I think that, now as a creative team, we're much more in sync. Like I feel like she knows my strength and I know her strengths, and we can turn stuff around really, really quickly now. We had a feature film that was in development for about 5 years with Screen Australia, which was an idea that I had, and then Jem sort of made her contribution. And then the plan was I'd written it, I was going to be in it, and she was going to direct it. And then it started taking so long to get made that I aged out of a part. And so we started looking to other actors. But we brought on another producer, and she was really great at sort of lifting the veil off the whole Australian sort of funding system, Screen Australia, Screen New South Wales, because that's a whole kind of red tape bureaucracy that can be very overwhelming. But she helped us navigate that. And so what Screen Australia did was they gave us 2 rounds of development, which was incredible because that essentially means they pay you to write, and, you get to pick a script producer to work with or like a mentor. And so I worked with 2 really great women, very different. One was very into sort of creative, imaginative side. Then the other one was much more didactic and analytical and intellectual,
conscientious,
So it was a good balance of, one was more about letting the imagination and creativity and story flow, and the other one was much more about sticking to structure and what is the theme of this and all that kind of stuff. We went in for production, and so after 2 rounds of development, we thought we're in the box seat. All the feedback had been amazing. We had our final production meeting with Screen Australia, and I walked out of that thinking I was a genius. I thought I was like Charlie Kaufman or something. They were so effusive about the script and the changes we'd made. But then they announced the funding for that round, and we didn't get it. In fact, there was 8 films in our round, and none of them got funded. Now, I think that was more of an indication of where the Australian screen industry in general is, that funding is going more into television, that feature films are becoming an increasingly risky investment, and unless you have Russell Crowe attached to your film or you have a producer with a proven track record, it's really difficult to get a feature film made. But just like Exit Films and just like our first production company, I'm like, well, what a great learning experience. We had 4 years of development with Screen Australia, in which I got to work with these amazing mentors, and I learned so much about screenwriting and so much about the film industry, and I think it's really put us in a good position when we move forward on our next project.
And how are you viewing? Because this is really interesting to me. I mean, this whole space, we've had some good mates of ours who've been on the show, Stepmate Studios. They've sold and are releasing a cartoon on Channel 7. I think they wrapped about 3 weeks ago. I don't know when the release date is. It was meant to be before the Olympics, and then it was going to be after, and then the Olympics was cancelled. And now so it's going to be maybe August. And it's been fascinating listening to their experience of getting a show on free-to-air TV. And, I mean, I'm fascinated by the fact that you've got Stan here locally. You got Netflix, which is buying some local production pieces depending on how big the audience is. But we're really like, if you look at the main networks, you've got news, sport, reality TV, and reruns.
Yeah.
And some original pieces maybe here spotted across the space. And cartoons have been one of those big things that they've looked to do. But how if you were to look at like the next 5 years and you wanted to sell a film or a TV show in Australia and be Australian made, how do you see the dynamics of the industry, including something like Screen Australia?
Well, look, who knows? I mean, that's the $1 million question. In the amount of kind of Screen Australia did a big Zoom meeting at the start of the year that anyone could watch, which was a discussion about this very fact, like, where are we going in terms of these new platforms? And I don't know. Like, I mean, I'm interested. There seems to be lots of different ways in. A big issue facing Australia is this freeze on content quotas. Like, I understand why that was brought in at the start of the pandemic, but those quotas need to be reinstated, because otherwise there is just zero incentive for either streaming or free to air to make Australian content, because it's so expensive when you can buy a proven hit sitcom for 30 grand, or you can spend 300,000 making something here.
Yeah.
I feel like free to air is, it's probably on shaky ground.
It's a nice way of putting it.
I just can't see how. Well, anecdotally, from my own, I can't remember the last time I watched free to air.
Yeah.
It's just, why would you? It seems annoying to watch, to have ads. Ads seem intrusive, but I don't know what the solution is. Like, what I'm kind of hoping will happen, if there's any silver lining to this pandemic, is that more production will be coming to Australia from the States or from countries where they have restrictions on production there. But I think that doesn't solve the local industry issue.
It doesn't. It really doesn't. There's massive issues with it. Another guy we know is Michael Cusack, and he's sold most of his shows now to Adult Swim. And he just, I was chatting to him the other day because we both just bought a new camera rig for our respective businesses, and we're trying to fucking fiddle around with like the cage and whatever. Yeah, his last show, which was called YOLO 1.5 or some shit like that, got sold to Adult Swim. Like no one here wanted it. And all these other stuff was done with Screen Australia, and I think it was with the ABC. So you had this thing called Koala Man and a bunch of other random stuff. But it's sort of, it makes me wonder, we're going to have this stage where there's going to be very little bought by these services, and then all of a sudden there's going to be an option or maybe a niche service that's going to come out. It's going to be, we're 100% Australian only. Well, and people will go, well, I want that.
We were having discussions with Stan at one point about distribution of our feature film, and even, very, very preliminary discussions about a TOFOP TV show. And their issue was that, and this was, a few years ago now, but they were still not in profit. Like, they were still running at a loss. They were hoping to break even in that year in particular. And so they were saying, we don't have any money to give you in terms of production, but we've got a fair bit of money we can spend on promotion. So their sort of proposal was, if you can find another company to partner with us, preferably an international company that can also do international sales, then that's something that we could help with. And I think Stan do a great job with their P&A. Like, you'd always see bus stop posters and billboards and hear them on podcasts and stuff like that. And I think that my mate who used to work there, his goal was, he wanted to scoop up all those Australian productions that were just being ignored or forgotten, and creating a real strong national identity and brand for Stan, which I think they've sort of done in a lot of ways. Like, a lot of those TV shows, like your Wolf Creeks and your Romper Stompers and stuff, have all been done on Stan, and they do exclusive feature films as well. But you've got to just ask where the money's coming from, and I just don't know what the answer to that is. Like, their problem is that, so I've been subscribing to Stan for the last few months because we've been watching Mad Men, and it's allowed us to find the actual thing that pulled me in was The Great. I don't know if you saw that. No, I've heard it's really good.
It's amazing, amazing show. And I think it was an original HBO. It might have been an HBO thing. But the problem they have is that they're competing with Foxtel. Like, in terms of budget, everyone goes for Netflix because there's obvious benefits to Netflix, but then it becomes a decision between what is now Binge and Stan. But I think that if they can stay in the game, that eventually they'll supersede Binge and Foxtel, because Foxtel has these legacy this legacy infrastructure that they'll always have to pay for because they'll always be servicing people over cable in some form.
Yeah.
And they'll just be able to beat them because the fact that they're going over the top on the net.
Yeah.
But where that money comes from is exactly what you said, right? Like how long can they last?
Yeah, I mean, I would envision for all streaming services that there will be tiers of subscription at a certain point, kind of like podcasts. All podcasts have advertising now. And then, if you want the premium service with no ads, you sign up at the website or whatever. I imagine that will happen with the streaming services.
Yeah, well, that's been the thing on, what's the... Digiday is like my favorite media TV sort of subscription, and they're speaking about how everything's been unbundled for the last 5 years with Netflix and whatnot. And now I just bought an Apple TV, and it's just like I just want to pay one price. I just want to get it all. I just want to bundle. I don't want to have to sign up to like the other night. I wanted to watch St Kilda play, and I had to get my fucking KO. So that took me a whole quarter to get set up because it was like, oh, you've got this email address and this number's already connected to this account. It's just like it's a head fuck.
Yeah.
So I
think don't worry. Disney will come in and just fucking buy everything, and then everything will be through Disney.
That's good because I own shares in Disney because I realized that eventually Disney will just fucking own everything.
Yeah, that's right.
I want to touch on, before we get into Wil and TOFOP, what's life been like for you the last 6 months? COVID, that's a thing.
You know what? Like, funnily enough, it hasn't changed that much because we've got a baby, and so she's 10 months old now, and so we're pretty much housebound. Prior to the pandemic, we were traveling a lot. Jem was shooting all over the country. We'd been in Brisbane and Adelaide and Melbourne, and so we were flying all over the shop. And that was, I mean, do you remember back when the bushfires were the worst things we had to worry about?
Seems like a lifetime ago.
Long time ago. And so when it all kicked off, like everyone, apprehensive and stuff. And then the biggest fear is like, how are we going to make an income? Gemma had booked a fairly big whiskey commercial that was meant to be shooting all over the world. She's going to be going to the Himalayas and the Philippines and stuff. It was a dream job. And then that all got put on hold. Shit. But thankfully, she managed to kind of, she and the producer of this job managed to kind of keep the client enthused about it and say, well, let's just do a really long pre-production. And it just gives us the opportunity to be really, meticulous about this. And so I sort of helped them. It wasn't a commercial. It was more like a 10-minute sort of content piece for this whiskey brand. So I came on as the writer. And so the three of us were working on it together. And that was good in that first, say, 6 weeks because nothing really changed for us. We sort of would go out and do a bit of it, 1 hour of exercise a day. And then we work from home. I have an office across the road from our apartment. So we just split our time between those two places and we just kept working. And then as things in New South Wales, and I'm knocking on wood now, as things tended to sort of relax a bit and open up a bit, work started to pick up again. And so we've been very lucky, very lucky. We've managed to sort of be working consistently the whole time. I'm doing a lot more daddy daycare at the moment, when Jen has her shoot days, and, they're adapting their shooting to COVID as well. Like, she did one job remotely. She was a face on an iPad.
Really?
for a set in Melbourne. Yeah, she did a car commercial. So it's been pretty good. And, I've written a new feature film. I've written a bunch of things. I've written a new feature film, a web series and a TV show. So the lockdown has given me a chance to sort of sit at my computer a bit more and actually get these ideas out that I've been thinking of.
Yeah, one thing it's given us is an excuse to do things that have been put off for quite some time. And it makes sense. I mean, if Jem is working a lot, then you pick up the slack on babysitting. And I feel like for a lot of households, that's what it's become. You've just become tighter in terms of your household income and jobs that have to be done. And you just got to get through the next 6 to 12 months. Yeah,
I mean, to be honest, like, we live in an apartment, and it does feel a little like after 6 months of this, it feels tiny. I used to think it was quite spacious, and we were pretty good for the eastern suburbs of Sydney. But now I'm like, fuck, man. I mean, what I'd give to live in a house with a backyard.
This is the thing that I've had, because we live in East Melbourne and record here, and I've sort of, I knew we needed an office. And so after the first lockdown, we went looking at office space, and I was just like, fuck, these people are delusional in commercial real estate.
Yeah.
To think that I'd pay, it was like the cheapest quote we got was like $2,500 on Collins Street for 20 square meters or something like that. That's like 2/3 the size of this space here. And we've got 4 or 5 staff now. So it's just not going to do. And I was like, okay, we'll put it off. But now I'm just like, I need to get out. I'm sick of being in the city. I want something a bit more suburban.
Yeah. Well, I think that's what we're all learning, right?
I know, right?
Working from home, but having a space in home that you can work in. Like you can't just, I mean, I'm at my kitchen table now, but generally I have that office space across the road, and just that little bit of separation while still being walking distance to my apartment just makes all the difference. So much more productive.
Have you guys taken up, I know mask use was recommended. Have you guys been doing that in Sydney much? Yes. Apart from jobs and whatnot?
Yeah. I mean, generally when I go to crowded areas like shopping centres, or I actually caught a plane on the weekend and wore a mask. So just up to Ballina, up to Byron. So we've been pretty conscientious. I've never washed my hands more than I do now. I'm like bloody Lady Macbeth, just trying to scrub the blood out constantly.
I think we're still not seeing the effects of the stage 4 lockdown yet, but the mask wearing has definitely helped. In my opinion, longer term, it's probably going to be the only thing that allows the country to eliminate the virus, because logically, if you keep opening up, and then I think as New Zealand has found this week, and then you lock down, yes, you get a reprieve for a few months, but it's always within the community. So I think mask wearing, if that allows people to live somewhat of a normal life for a period of time that doesn't ruin the economy and people's livelihoods, but also keeping people healthy, then you've sort of got a good in between.
And if you've done any travel through Asia, many countries, it's just the norm.
Well, my partner and I love going to Japan, and because it's such a quick and easy flight in Asia, and it's such a modern and amazing place to go, and just the commonality of people wearing masks. Like we always thought it weird that it's so normal to wear masks there, and then you would come back here, and so people would all be wearing masks on the flight because they're predominantly Japanese flying to and from Australia. You get some tourists, but as soon as you land, everyone's like like on the plane or when you get into the airport, and it is a weird cultural aspect of the West that we don't have that. Yeah. I got to ask, I don't actually know how you and Charlie met.
You and Will?
You and Will, rather.
Well, probably through those comedians that I mentioned earlier, like Michael Chamberlain and Charlie Pickering. So those guys started moving into stand-up. And then I believe we first met at a gig that Will was doing with Adam Spencer in Melbourne. I think Michael or Charlie or both invited me to this gig, and we met at the gig. And I remember thinking, what a dickhead. He made fun of me. I was wearing a red beanie at the time, and he made fun of me looking like Fred Durst. And I was like, all right, okay, I see. That's how it is it? But then we caught up again. I think I'd just moved to Sydney. And that's right, Charlie Pickering, I'd moved to Sydney. Charlie Pickering had moved up because he just got a job on Triple J. And so he was mates with Will. And so we started hanging out. I remember there was one night we were hanging out after a show that he'd done or Charlie had done. And we were just bullshitting. And we started talking about football. And he was like a big Bulldogs fan. I'm a big Saints fan. And so, that we had a bit of common. And then we started talking about the wrestling. It's like, and so we sort of realized we had some sort of stuff in common. And then it's just it's a very natural progression of a friendship. It's just like we lived in the same area in Bondi, and Back then Will's hips still worked, and so we'd often go for a run, like a coastal run, and just talk shit. And then we had different groups of friends, but then we sort of brought them together, and then our friends became friends, and so it became just a little community of people living in Sydney. It was actually, a lot of us were expat Melbourne. I think that's sort of what bonded us all. Is we're all, we had Melbourne personalities, but living in Sydney. So I think
it makes sense.
Came together that way. Yeah.
It's funny how you all chose. Was Will living in Bondi? You said.
Yes. Yeah.
Why does everyone fucking choose? Bondi is like the place, isn't it?
Well, yeah, because it's beautiful. I mean, I know people take the piss out of Bondi, but it's still breathtaking when you arrive there. To have a beach of that quality, only 15 minutes from the CBD is pretty extraordinary.
When you look back the last 10 years doing this TOFOP, the whole thing, the two guys, one cup, what's sort of been the highs and lows of it all?
I don't think there's been many lows. I think that we sort of went into it not really knowing what it was going to be or if it was going to be anything. We just were big fans of Kevin Smith's podcast, Smodcast, which was just him and his producer and friend Scott Mosier just catching up. And so that was the initial sort of formula. And I think, as the audience started to grow and, we started hooking up with like Dave Anthony and Greg Barron and, then Gareth and all these American comics, and we started getting a bigger audience, that we sort of realized that we either had to do something with it or it was just always going to be whatever it is. And so I think the highlight really has just been how enthused and loyal our listeners are. Like after 10 years, there's not many people who listen to a podcast for 10 years, but a lot of our listeners have stuck with us the whole time, like the people at the start, the people who are still listening. And I always get a kick out of, feedback we get from people who really love an episode, who will get in contact to say that, something made them laugh, or, if it's not like we don't get memed necessarily, but I will see a lot of people sending around follow-up information on a topic we've discussed, or anytime Kathy Bates appears on someone's television, we'll get sent a clip of that, and so I really like that.
It's funny how you guys starting as one of the original podcasters impacted a lot of people. Like when I do my usual research, I'll just chat to people here and there. I watch the Daily Talk Show interview. Our account director, he's a Sri Lankan bloke who is now dual citizen, and he's a very internationally minded guy, but he loves your podcast.
Yeah, right.
And he started listening when he first came here, maybe a few years after he came here, probably 2012, 13. And he's like, oh, yeah, I used to listen to TOFOP. He's the TOFOP guy, right?
Yeah, right.
So he doesn't actually know anything about Home and Away. He's never watched Home and Away here, even though he's now, a bona fide Australian. But
that was the interesting thing when I started doing Home and Away, and Channel 7 had issues with me doing TOFOP at the same time. And I was always a bit puzzled by that, because I was always like, well, they're two completely different audiences. I don't think anyone who, watches Home and Away is going to listen to TOFOP and suddenly stop watching Home and Away. Like, if anything, it's like a curiosity piece. But
yeah, that was it. That was weird.
Yeah, but it was just, I get that a lot. I mean, obviously I'm not a comedian, and so this is like the most comedy specific thing that I do. And people, when they get in contact with us, often point out the fact it's like, Will, I love your stand-up special, and I love this and I love that, and Charlie, I have no idea what else you do besides TOFOP. I'm like, well, that's fine. You're not my audience. But it's this thing that whether or not TOFOP actually TOFOP the show, if it becomes anything, or if it just stays TOFOP, then that's fine. I think what we're sort of interested now in is the associated content relating to TOFOP. Like the fact that, I mean, if there wasn't TOFOP, there'd be no Philosophy. If there wasn't TOFOP, there'd be no FOFOP. There'd be no Two Guys, One Cup. All these things that were spun off it. have come from, TOFOP. And it really is still effortless after all these years. Like Will and I can sit down and just start talking and get an hour down easily with absolutely no prep.
Yeah.
And I think that's the kind of simple pleasure of it. And we don't really want to mess with that.
It's really what you have is well structured. You've got basically an outlet for you as a writer to develop things.
Exactly.
And shoot the shit with someone who's willing to do it. And you've got a great team that can help you sell the brand in Planet Broadcasting.
Yeah.
I've interviewed Claire, and her and James are quite amazing at what they do. Really, if you think about it, they're the only real independent podcast network in Australia.
Yeah.
So you've got yourself a good little consistent thing, which allows you to do other passion projects, whether it's short films, the TVC production. Have you found a way to draw a wage at all yet for any of the stuff? I know you guys are ones for putting all the money back into whatever fucking ridiculous promotion you've got going on.
Yeah. No, we are more focused on that now, obviously, during the pandemic. It's like, we think that if there's any time that we should maybe look at drawing a wage, it'd be now. So we've started to slowly monetize the podcast, not in any great amount, but enough for it to be like, okay, well, this is worth the time that we're putting into it. And a lot of that has come from just our Patreon. Like that would be, I'd say the bulk and the most consistent of our income comes from crowdfunding, which to me seems like a fairly equitable trade-off because people can pay what they want rather than sort of saying you need to pay this amount of money to hear our show. It's like, we understand that people have different circumstances and different budgets. And so just give what you can. And I mean, at the start, when we started our Patreon, we had sort of like tiered levels of reward. And then I was like, we'll just open it all up. Whatever you can contribute is whatever you can contribute. And I think that's been much better in terms of encouraging people to either sign up or stay signed up and just adjust accordingly. Like because I see the figures and I see people will drop down their donation amount and then they will up it back up again when obviously they're feeling a bit more flush. And so there is this kind of engagement, with the audience, and we try and keep this stuff transparent, That's why we sort of would say to people, look, we're not taking an income from it. This is just to keep the show running. And that is predominantly true now. But, we're trying to balance the crowdfunding, which is the bulk of our income, with some sponsorship, which enables us to sort of, keep guys like Fosdyke on the payroll and podcast Michael Liberale, he's our new producer, and
Mike Howell,
and all those guys. It's all been about putting the production first. But yes, like definitely, we want to draw an income from it. Like that is the major goal. I mean, it's the $1 million question about how do you do that with podcasting.
Well, you mentioned it on the Daily Talk Show, and I've come to realize this, that you got supplementary sponsorships which pay for your probably fixed costs for the year. And then I think really where you can make the cream on the top will be subscription. We've just started managing two talented creators here in Victoria, and they both respectively have massive audience, like 3 million a piece on TikTok, on Instagram. It's over hundreds of thousands, same with YouTube, and they're quite young. And I think when you don't have, though, the CPM here locally, like it's all predominantly US based, it just makes a lot more sense to have that direct audience, that direct relationship with the audience. And Patreon's quite amazing for that.
Yeah. Well, that was the Planet Broadcasting thing as well. Like when we started talking to those guys, like I'd been a huge fan of the Weekly Planet for ages.
Yeah.
And James and I'd been sort of just communicating on Twitter. And then I just wanted to talk to him and Clara just to find out how they were doing what they were doing, because we were thinking of moving in the same direction with the network. And then we had our first meeting and they told us the numbers they were getting. I'm like, holy shit, like you don't need us at all. Like, because we were thinking it'd be like a mutually beneficial relationship, we could drive some TOFOP audience, but they didn't really have a huge local following, but huge international audience. And, they were struggling to get any advertisers in Australia to listen to them. And I'm like, you're crazy. Like, these guys are massively popular. If you had an Australian brand and you available for purchase in the US, you'd be crazy not to throw an ad on the Weekly Planet.
Yeah, absolutely nuts. And I think it just highlighted why Patreon and subscription-based services are so fucking valuable. All right, I want to jump into some rapid fire questions to finish things off. Well, actually, quick thing.
Yep.
Dadpod, you guys are starting to record in August, yeah?
No, we've recorded. It's done. It's just been mixed. We were just looking for a time because Osher's shooting The Masked Singer. So we're just looking for a time to release where we could actually make the most of it and publicize it. But obviously he's down in Melbourne shooting that and we'll be in quarantine. So I think the plan is the end of August, we'll do a bit of a publicity blitz and get season 2 out.
Do you guys, like what you do with Wil, do you have your own production team or was that done with someone else?
No, we have our own. Osher has his own production team. Osher's got a deal with Acast and they do all the production, yeah.
All right, rapid fire questions.
Okay.
Morning, evening routine. What does that look like over the last 6 months?
All baby focused. Everything at the moment is based around child meal and sleep times, which I've gotten quite good at.
Okay. Speaking of babies, biggest insight since becoming a father?
That sleep is the greatest gift known to man.
So if you look at my partner and I at the moment, we're meant to be getting married October. It's now April. Kids is definitely on the cards and we're sort of debating when at the moment. The thing I keep asking parents is what is the thing they miss the most? And it seems like sleep is that thing.
Yeah.
Would you just maximize the shit out of it or would you try and sort of acclimatize your body? Because I don't want to go from sleeping 10 hours on a weekend to, you know, having to go straight into like 6-7 hours.
I reckon acclimatize. If I try and get used to no sleep now. I think don't try and cash in all your credits now. It'll be too much of a shock to the system.
Okay. Best purchase under $200 that you've utilized during this period?
Probably my air fryer. I bought an air fryer because I like to cook healthy. And
like you are full dad mode now, aren't you?
It's the best. It's the best. Only just a half a teaspoon of oil, and you get crispy chips, and you can fry fish and make desserts. It's I use my air fryer pretty much every day, I reckon.
Wow. I like that. That's a good one. Jason PJ we've had on, they're obsessed with fucking air fryers. I think Jace Hawkins has got like 4 at home.
Yeah, I'm thinking of upgrading. It's like, this one's not big enough. I want to cook a whole chicken.
All right, last one for you. If you were to choose a podcast, no, not a podcast, a doco, TV show or movie during this whole period that you've been watching, what would it be and why?
Well, it's just because it's fresh in my mind, but there's an amazing 6-part series on Monty Python on Netflix that I've just finished, and it's fantastic. I don't know what it's called.
Jacob,
I think it's called The Not Quite Accurate History of Monty Python or something like that. It's some jokey title, but it is brilliant. It's just amazing footage, and they interview all the main players and just following their entire careers from being University Review right up until just before their final live show that they did the O2. But I just loved it. That's what triggered my Monty Python rabbit hole journey.
We'll have to watch that once we're done with Mad Men.
Yeah.
Charlie, thanks for coming on, mate.
My pleasure. Anytime.
I know we had some camera issues, but where can people find you on the interwebs?
I'm CX Clausen on Twitter, on Instagram, at Charlie_Clausen, and you can find our podcast at TOFOP.com.
Jacob, our producer, one of our producers will link all that stuff there. But, mate, I'm glad we finally did this.
Yeah, only, 12 months in the making?
12 months.
12 months.
I feel like it was like 18 months.
Yeah, bushfires, pandemic, but we finally got there. And the camera broke.
The camera broke. Fucking... I worked out what it was in the end, but there you go.
No,
all right, thanks for doing this, mate.
All good, mate. Speak soon.
Thank you so much for watching Uncommon and this week's episode. If you like it, smash that like button. If you want to keep up to date with what we're doing, please do subscribe. We would love that. We'd love to build this audience that we're growing here of uncommoners. If you want to keep up to date with audio, you can search for us on all of your good podcast apps. It's Uncommon or Uncommon Show will typically find us. For social, you want to see behind the scenes this amazing studio that I'm sitting in, just search at uncommon_show and everything will be there, including our weekly promos. But look, thanks so much for stopping by. Until next time, thanks for watching.